agenda. Okay, so we're talking about,
Dr. Rishi Gandhi, Scott Carson, how are you, man?
yeah, man. How are you doing? How are you doing? Looking forward to our discussion today.
Likewise.
All
So
right.
you were asking about pulse dye lasers, PDLs, and we were specifically going to kick around some of the experience that I had in selling and supporting pulse dyes, primarily the VBeam 1, the VBeam 2, or the Perfecta, and the Cynosure Synergy, which is a pulse dye coupled with a 1064 long pulse. And over the years, we've learned a great deal about pulse dye systems, how they're manufactured, the consumables that go with them, the instability, the cost of ownership. And you don't own one, but you're thinking about getting one. You've utilized one significantly in the past. And so I guess my first question is, from a clinical standpoint, what about the VBeam Perfecta is such an amazing device? And then secondarily, why do so many derms find it to be the go-to laser for so many things in their practice?
As a clinical dermatologist, it's ingrained in you, in your training, in your textbooks, in the research studies, how robust the 595 nanometer wavelength has data on clinical applications, particularly rosacea, blood vessels, treating scars, erythematous scars, bruising. Because of being creatures of habits and training, naturally, it's immediately the first laser that most dermatologists want to get. But like we've discussed, cost of ownership can be prohibitive, and people don't understand that when they're making that investment in this equipment. And I only learned about it through practices I worked at before I started my own. So I've had experience using the Synergy, the first generation VBeam, the VBeam Perfecta, and every owner, every clinic would have to deal with the hassles of dye kits, maintenance issues, calling in a tech, and that became problematic. So as a result, when I started my own practice, I really used the IPL and a solid state diode Qtip laser for the number of my vascular applications. However, they still don't compare to the pulse dye for red scars and bruising. And that's the sort of challenge in a dermatology and cosmetic practice.
One of the things that we've seen in the over probably 100 pre-owned pulse dyes that we've purchased and sold is that even if they're under a service contract from the manufacturer, they're surprisingly under-maintained. And what I mean by that is, even though you're paying on a service contract on average 10 plus thousand a year in a service contract, or over 1,000 a month typically goes to the laser first before a clinician can make any money on it, we find that the manufacturers do the least amount of work and do the least and install the least amount of parts to keep it up and running barely.
Yep.
So what we see is when we purchase one, even though it may be under a Candela or a Cynosure service contract, when we get it, it's just barely passing specification or not passing at all. And the initial reaction in the pre-owned market is to just put in a new die kit. And any tech with a average amount of skills can dial up that die kit to get it to pass. And so when we first started selling them years ago, we were doing, what we thought was the right thing, which is simply just putting in a die kit, having Candela techs or Candela tech trains put them in, and inevitably there was failures almost right out of the gate, and it became very problematic. And so I think that's what a lot of people do in the secondary market. A lot of clinicians will buy one, throw in a die kit, or they'll buy one from a reseller that they put a die kit in. But we found if you don't do a full optical PM, and that means replacing the flow tubes, the lamps, the mirrors, they call the OC mirrors, a full fiber refurbishment, replacement of all the lenses in the handpiece, a dye kit, but there's the correct type of dye kit. There's a lot of companies in the secondary market that make dye kits, and unless you do all those things, which can easily, in parts alone, be $7,000 or $8,000, and the labor alone can be a better part of a day or two, so a few thousand more, so about 10,000. Even on a device that's been under a service contract by one of the manufacturers, you will get an unstable device. So these things require an enormous amount of work just to get them to where they're stable. And then when you do that, you still have to expect a substantial amount of ongoing cost of about $1,000 a month after the warranty period that's been provided. And I think that's something that clinicians, especially dermatologists, don't know, because they always worked at a place that had one, but they never owned it themselves. And so this is often a shock.
I think it's absolutely right. Came as a shock to me because it's such a go-to device. So I had to reformulate and rethink about the power and capabilities of other technologies. And that's why I don't have a pulse dye as one of the earliest devices that I purchased for my practice. Still a possibility to get one, but like you talked about, cost of ownership, looking into the idea that this is what you're going to have to spend monthly or yearly, and how that's going to cover overhead in your practice, and be the cost of the patient actually to get those treatments, and staying competitive against other offices in your area. So be challenging.
That you and I have talked about in the past is the difference between the first generation Candela VBeam 1 and the VBeam Perfecta.
Sure.
And you've got some thoughts on that from footprint and sound, and from the noise and a few other things. You want to comment on that?
Yeah. So two things. One is, it's a larger footprint. So in a dermatology practice that sees lots of patients, every medical patient can be a candidate for a vascular laser treatment. Having them move rooms to a laser room can be slowing down your workflow and can be challenging. So the newer generations are nicer for their footprint. However, they cost more. The Perfecta, the second one, has a nice touchscreen interface. It powers on faster. The first one, you have to turn it on and wait a good amount of warm-up time. And that device has got to stay on, unplugged, or plugged in all the time for the whole day. And that's how dermatology offices in the 90s, early 2000s use that device. That's just not as advantageous now when you're trying to do higher volume patient workflow. Devices that turn on faster, like an XLV, an IPL, other vascular lasers, the Candela Nordless, have that more advantage to just power on right away, wheel in the room, and do a treatment.
You've used both a VBeam 1 and a Perfecta. I've heard from some clinicians they prefer the VBeam 1 because you can adjust the settings versus the Perfecta that has presets. I don't know if that's true or if I'm saying it the right way.
Yeah, that's absolutely not true. I think there's a good touchscreen, which the first generation does not have a touchscreen. So you have a nice graphic user interface touchscreen that guides you. So whether it's vessels, scars, programming, and you can absolutely put it in custom settings, do whatever you want. So I'm not sure about that. I just think that the first generation is been around a long time and can meet your applications if you use it right. I like the Perfecta, but the Perfecta has a lot of issues, and cost of ownership can be higher than the first generation. So
yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I can't say that I can quantify this. So it's a very subjective statement in that we've sold just as many VBeam 1s as we have Perfectas. And I would say that the VBeam 1s, interestingly, are more stable. I'm not sure why that is. It's just a sense that I have. The other thing is that VBeam 1, Candela's telling everybody they're not going to support the VBeams ones anymore. But what people don't realize is that's forcing a lot of people to upgrade to Perfectas. And so there's lots of VBeam One part systems out there for little to no money. So it's actually created a great market for VBeam Ones again because there's so many part systems available.
That's great. What is Candela going to continue to support VBeam One parts? If you have this marketplace for them, can someone have a VBeam One for 15, 20 years of their practice?
Yes, because of the 1,000+ systems that are now being displaced by newer IPL technology that can do much of what a VBeam can do. Not all of it, as you noted, but a lot of it. And for smaller practices that, or even medium-sized practices, or those practices that don't want to deal with the frustration and cost of a Perfecta or any PDL, they're going to lean towards an IPL. There's so many VBeam Ones on the secondary market that you could buy for little to no money as parts backup systems. It makes sense that you could run it easily 10 to 15 years because of the parts availability of these surplus systems. And you have to understand for them, fundamentally, the operating functionality of these systems is very similar. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a big difference between a VBeam One and a Perfecta, no question, but the actual underlying engineering is the same. And so I don't see that. And by the way, the die is identical. So it uses the absolutely same die. And so there's that's the most critical element of the system. So that's not going to be a barrier.
Okay.
There's a good argument outside of the warm-up time and the size to have a VBeam One, because you're going to save $20,000 right now on a VBeam One over a Perfecta.
Let's give your idea though. A patient comes in for filler and gets a bruise. You can treat that bruise right away with conservative PDL settings that are going to give consistent results. You need to free up that room for the next patient. A cosmetic patient's coming in is going to ask more questions and want more services, and you're going to convert right away. You're already behind, and now you got to treat this bruise. You did filler by a cheek eyelid area, and there was this tiny little bruise, unexpected. To go put them in a room and wait 30 minutes for that thing to turn on
doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense. And for dermatology offices, you don't know what's going to come in the door that day. So to have a room with that pulse dye turned on and just left on like a car all day, I don't think that's possible now, because you want quicker turnaround time for your rooms and your treatments. So so that's the argument for maybe the Perfecta. Higher cost, however, for those niche applications, and you want to have the technology but not have to invest as much, the first generation looks like an appealing option, something I probably will look into in 2022. So
a couple of things that we're talking about Perfectas, just some things I would share is, few people know this, I found, is with a Perfecta or a VBeam, you want to run that device even when you're not using it, to cycle the dye, to keep the dye from seeping into the porous ceramic cavity.
yeah,
And when you don't cycle it, that dye will sit in the cavity, which is, as I mentioned, ceramic. And over time, that's where in a very short period of time, if it's not circulating, you'll no longer be able to calibrate it with the 10 millimeters. So clinicians need to get in the habit of actually cycling it 2-3 times a week for several hours, even if they're not using it. The other thing that I find so surprising is, you're getting a lot of debris when you fire this into the lens. You want to speak about that, where that comes from and why? Because I'm not sure people understand, or clinicians understand, how much comes off the skin and hits that lens.
Yeah, this can be an issue. Compared to other lenses like an ablative laser, where you take acetone or 95% alcohol, really clean the lens really well. I got to be honest, in my training, it was not really instructed to do anything with those individual lenses after a treatment with pulse dye.
And this is what's interesting, is you have all that debris coming on, and if you don't clean it, it will burn on that lens. And these lenses are $1,000 to replace them. And
So,
it's
so
turned into a real market opportunity for the manufacturers, when just simple cleaning the lens will save you a lot of money.
and a market for the techs that service these devices. So you have these lenses that come in with built-in spacers. Tell us, Scott, we get the lens. How are you actually supposed to, you get a Q-tip? Are you supposed to go in? The idea, again, like you're doing rapid treatments, you're doing spots, vessels, angioma, short scars. Do you clean at the end of the day? Do you clean after each treatment? Is it like,
You clean after each treatment, and depending on the debris from the field, you need to clean during the treatment, because it doesn't take much for that debris to start to burn. And what you'll end up with, what appears to be a crack in the lens, when in fact it's just a divot that's created from the heat generated from that debris
yeah,
being hit with the laser.
good point.
And so,
I think having that education as part of the onboarding for the device is really important and not part of it.
well, typically manufacturers don't want you to do these things. And the reason they don't want you to do them is because they want you to buy service contracts. And you know my general feeling on service contracts, and I think yours as well, is they're great for manufacturers and they're bad for clinicians. And this is an example where if you cycled your device, you make sure your fiber has a protected field where people aren't trying to squeeze by it, because we see a lot of fibers that are broken by people being too close to it, having to walk by it, and they'll snap it the way it sits in the holster. And then cleaning the lenses, those three things can add 3, 6, 12 months potentially in life, and to the PDL, and limit your repairs.
Do you need to invest in yearly preventative maintenance on that device where someone opens up the exoskeleton, changes filters? Is there a checklist for once a year a tech coming in and doing something with that device?
I think the general rule is yes. 6 to 12 months you should come in and vacuum out the dust, change the filters, calibrate it, clean the lenses, clean the optics if there's optics on the inside. That always makes sense, because lasers run cooler when they're running efficiently, and they're less likely to have major problems. So there's no question that's important. On the VBeam, it's a little more interesting, because it's very rare that any pulse dye system will actually make it a year without needing a service. So I kind of don't recommend it, because it's just so likely that you're going to have a failure.
Okay.
If you don't have a failure in a year, you need to thank the laser gods, and you need to get a PM.
So I also like another device, the Photona SP Dynamis Pro, and I've had it for a year, and the tech that works on it's fantastic, and I think it's a worthwhile yearly preventive maintenance where they check all the voltages, they check the quality of the firing of the shots, the electrical, the alternate power, the diagnostics, the software, all this other stuff. I used to not be thinking it's a worthwhile yearly investment, but for some devices it can be. So
I know we talked briefly about this the other day in text, but I think you showed me a picture of a filter on the Photona.
Yeah.
And it was pretty dirty.
Yeah, that was when I first bought it. It was a used unit, and the previous owner did not do filter changes or invest in the regular preventive maintenance. So, with use, that filter, if it's brown, I mean, the water going in, so actually changing the water, draining the water, and adding new distilled water into the apparatus is going to be important. And with use, the fibers, checking them, especially the YAG fiber, really getting an acetone and cleaning it, taking a vacuum, cleaning all the filters. Busy clinicians don't have time for this, so it's got to be part of their SOPs for their staff or someone to really keep up with this, just like an oil change on their car. They really got to do it for these devices if they plan to keep them around for the majority of their career. So
one last thing I'll say on the preventive maintenance on all devices, not just related to PDLs, is the most important reason that I think clinicians need preventive maintenance no less than once a year is really liability.
Yeah.
Having a service report on a device that it's been calibrated, the safety inspected, the voltage have been checked, the energy's coming out cleanly and correctly, there's no dust. If there ever is a patient incident, one of the nice things to be able to know in the back of your mind is your device was serviced correctly. And that is probably the single biggest factor in is patient safety and your sleep well, that you have devices that are firing at specification.
Good thoughts. Good thoughts.
Anything else you want to kick around on VBeams, Perfectas, synergies?
I do think it's really cool to see the application of the multiplex on the Synergy. First off, a 585, not a 595. And the limitations that I saw with it was that the pulse duration on the YAG was not long enough. So for certain vascular conditions, it didn't give the longer pulse duration needed. And so with the other device I have, it's a lot better. But sequentially in multiplex mode, giving that is kind of cool. And it looks like Alma, and this is not vascular, but Alma has now got this CO2 that's doing a multiplex mode with a non-ablative mid 1500 wavelength and a CO2. That's interesting. Paint and in a paint mode, painting a non-ablative and ablative wavelength together to create different levels of channels onto the skin for rejuvenation, resurfacing. So it's interesting to see how manufacturers might harness that sequential wavelength delivery in the future. I wonder if any other manufacturers are going to be doing that with vascular lasers, whether it's any new Korean devices, Lutronic. I know that they have some big vascular device coming out. So I haven't seen that reinvention come up since the Synergy, but it'll be interesting to see in a few years what happens.
Yeah, if you the first thing I'll say about the Synergy is that the long pulse, oddly, is a better long pulse hair removal system than it is a long pulse vascular system.
Yeah.
Although the concept, because of the pulse duration, the concept was good. And as you know, there's been lots of devices. One that you and I know well from our mentor and your colleague, Dr. Mark Taylor, is the Derma-K, which was really one of the first multi-parameter blended technologies, which was erbium YAG and CO2, which really didn't have a lot of practical applications. But the Synergy tried to mimic that, obviously, with different technologies. And now Alma, and I will tell you that many manufacturers around the world have called us looking to buy that new hybrid technology, if there's any pre-owned devices out there, because they want to get their hands on it to understand the histology. They want to see if there's actually something there that they may have not identified, that maybe Alma has. So I think over the next 6 to 12 months, we'll be able to see if that blended modality actually has some legs.
Very exciting stuff. Yeah.
Anything else you want to cover on PDLs? Or are we good for today?
I think we're good for today.
See you soon, bud.
Okay, bye.